ever popped a few painkillers, even just after, like a procedure or something, it's wild how fast something that, like, masks a pain can start to feel, well, kind of necessary,
Yeah,
Makes you think about that line between actual treatment and dependency.
Right.
And when you're talking about prison, where healthcare, well, it's a whole other beast.
Absolutely. A whole different ballgame.
That's where we're diving deep today. Opiate addiction and prison healthcare.
It's a crucial intersection for sure.
And it all started with some pretty eye-opening claims from Darren. We've got his YouTube video queued up. You familiar with him?
I haven't had the chance to dig into his stuff just yet.
Ex-footballer.
Yeah.
Bit of a straight shooter. Doesn't hold back, to say the least.
Sounds like he'll provide a unique perspective.
To say the least. So he tells this story about a doctor allegedly providing this codeine concoction, basically lean, to MMA fighters.
Wow.
And G even claims this doctor might have been gotten in trouble with the medical board. But here's where it gets interesting. He uses this whole anecdote, right, to launch into this broader conversation about painkillers in general, even say most of them have opiates, linking them to heroin.
That's a pretty bold statement.
He's clearly concerned about doctors overprescribing these medications, creating dependencies,
It's a valid concern, for sure. Opiates, while effective for pain, do carry that risk of dependence, especially with long-term use or misuse.
And Guy connects it directly to his own experience in Hull Prison. He says he saw widespread methadone use there and describes this like big policy shift. Years ago, it was cold turkey for inmates dealing with heroin addiction. Forced withdrawal, which he calls the rattle.
Ah, yes, the old cold turkey approach. It's certainly a far cry from the harm reduction and medication-assisted treatment principles that are more common now.
Exactly. And G claims this shift happened because of legal challenges, citing human rights and, prisoner well-being. So now, if someone's on a methadone prescription when they enter prison, they have to keep getting it. Seems reasonable on the surface, right? Like you're ensuring continuity of care.
Yeah, the intention there is understandable. You don't want to abruptly stop a medication someone is physiologically dependent on. Could be dangerous. But it also opens up a whole other can of worms. You're talking about long-term management, potential for things to get, misused, whether it actually addresses the root issue of the addiction itself.
And G does not shy away from those questions. He paints a pretty grim picture of what he sees as the downsides of this continued methadone use in prison. Deteriorating physical health, worse behavior, and a higher chance of ending up back in the system after release.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, no doubt. You want inmates to have access to medical care, absolutely. But you also don't want to create a situation where the medication, even if the intentions are good, might be feeding into a cycle of dependence. And this is where understanding opiate substitution therapy becomes really crucial.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What exactly is opiate substitution therapy? And how does that work, especially in a controlled environment like prison?
So essentially, it involves using medications like methadone to help manage the withdrawal symptoms and cravings that come with opiate addiction. It's about providing a safer, more controlled alternative to street drugs. Think heroin, for example.
So it's kind of like harm reduction, right? Meeting people where they're at, managing the dependency, hopefully in a way that, minimizes the negative stuff.
Exactly. It's a shift from punishing people to, recognizing that addiction is a complex medical condition. But G's observations kind of highlight the reality on the ground in prisons. It can be messy.
Right.
He even goes on to claim that he saw methadone being overprescribed, even used as a substitute for other meds when they were running low.
Wow. That's a pretty serious allegation. If that's true, that suggests some pretty major systemic issues.
Yeah, it raises some red flags for sure. And it speaks to the larger challenges of providing adequate health care in prisons in general, right? You're often dealing with limited resources, not enough staff, and then, of course, a population with some pretty complex needs.
It's like you're saying, even if, in theory, this opiate substitution therapy is the right approach, it all hinges on, actually having the system to back it up.
Exactly. It's not just about handing out meds, right? It's about comprehensive care.
Yeah.
Counseling, therapy, dealing with the underlying stuff that contributes to addiction in the first place.
Because if someone gets out of prison still struggling with all that, those underlying issues, the chances of them relapsing are...
Oh, they're much higher, definitely.
Right, back to the same environment, the same pressures.
Exactly. And that's why those reentry programs, the successful ones at least, are so crucial. Continuing support, access to health care, help with housing, finding a job, you name it.
So Guy painted a, well, kind of bleak picture of what he saw at Hull Prison.
Yeah.
Are there places doing it differently? Like, are there prisons that are having success with, treating opiate addiction?
Absolutely, there are. Some facilities have these really innovative programs that have seen some encouraging results. Like some have integrated peer support groups, mentorship programs, where former addicts, ones who've gone through treatment successfully, can guide and support those who are, still in recovery.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense. Having someone who gets it, who's been there,
Mhm.
that could be huge.
It can be transformative, yeah. And there's also growing recognition now that it's important to address trauma when you're talking about addiction treatment. A lot of people who end up incarcerated have experienced, well, significant trauma in their lives, and that can be a major driver of substance abuse.
So it's not just treating the addiction on its own, it's looking at the whole person, their past, their mental health.
Exactly. Recognizing the humanity of those who are incarcerated and understanding that addiction, well, it's a complex issue with multifaceted roots, you could say.
It feels like this whole conversation keeps coming back to needing a more, I don't know, holistic, compassionate approach to addiction treatment, both inside and outside prison walls.
That's the key takeaway here, I'd say. We can't just incarcerate addiction away, right? We got to invest in prevention, education, treatment programs that actually address the root causes of this whole crisis.
G's story, even though it was about his experience in one specific prison, it's opened this much bigger conversation about how we as a society view and deal with addiction.
He's given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. And even though his observations might not show the full picture, they definitely highlight a system struggling with some really complicated questions and often, well, falling short of the ideal solutions.
It's a lot, right? We've gone from this one guy's experience in Hull Prison to like this huge conversation about opiate addiction, prison healthcare, even like how society views addiction as a whole.
It is a lot to process, yeah. And that's, I think, what makes Guy's story so important. It forces us to look at some uncomfortable things, to really, wrestle with these tough questions.
Yeah, like where do we go from here? If just keeping people on these opiate substitutes isn't the answer, but neither is just cutting them off cold turkey. I mean, what is the way forward?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer, no magic solution that fits every situation. But I think recognizing that there isn't one simple answer, that's a huge first step.
So it's not about finding a quick fix. It's about like long-term change
Absolutely.
to the whole system.
Exactly. We need to be putting money into research, right? To really understand addiction and figure out better ways to treat it. We need to be pushing for more funding for healthcare in prisons so they can actually provide the care that's needed. And we have to challenge the stigma around addiction. People need to feel like they can ask for help without feeling ashamed or judged.
And so we keep coming back to this, right? Moving away from punishment and towards a more, I don't know, humane, compassionate way of looking at addiction.
Absolutely. Addiction isn't some moral failing. It's a complex health issue, and it's often tied to things like poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity. If we really want to make a dent in this, we got to address those root causes, not just the addiction itself.
It's like we're talking about a whole new way of thinking about addiction.
Yeah.
Both like individually and as a society.
And that's where real change comes from, right? When we start to challenge our own biases, our assumptions, when we start to see people battling addiction as, well, as people who deserve compassion and support.
G's story, even though it was just one guy's experience, it made this whole issue so much more real than like just reading statistics or research papers.
There's something about hearing someone's story, even if it's messy, even if it's not perfect, It reminds us that these are real people with real lives behind these issues.
And those stories deserve to be heard. So as we as we wrap things up here, is there one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
Ooh, that's a tough one. But if I had to pick just one, I'd say approach these issues with curiosity, not judgment. Ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and be open to the idea that, well, you might learn something new.
It's about staying engaged, staying informed, and yeah, being open to different perspectives.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, these issues affect all of us, whether we realize it or not.
That's a great point to end on. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations going.